It was nearly midnight when the doorbell rang. The sound was jarring in the stillness of the house, a sharp, electric buzz that sliced through the muffled hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock above the stove. Lisa paused mid-swipe as she scrolled through her phone on the couch, her face momentarily lit by the screen's soft glow. Her husband Mark was upstairs asleep, oblivious to the disruption. Frowning, she set her phone down, the screen going dark, and moved toward the door. Who would be out this late? And why here? Peering through the peephole, Lisa saw nothing but the faint, distorted glow of the streetlight pooling on the sidewalk. She unlocked the door, her heart thudding just a little harder than she wanted to admit, and opened it. The cold night air slipped inside, making her shiver. A package sat on the welcome mat, square and plain, wrapped in brown paper. There was no return address, no markings save for her own name, scrawled in an uneven hand across the top. The handwriting was crude, almost childlike, but something about it made her stomach churn. She glanced out toward the street, but there was no one in sight, no sound of a car retreating into the distance. Just the gentle rustle of leaves and the faint whine of the wind. She picked up the package, surprised by its weight, and shut the door quickly, locking it behind her. The package smelled faintly of damp cardboard, and there was a greasy smudge on one corner, like it had been handled carelessly. Lisa carried it into the kitchen, setting it on the counter beneath the warm yellow glow of the pendant light. She hesitated before reaching for a knife to cut the tape, a faint unease prickling at the back of her neck. It was an odd hour for deliveries, but the handwriting was unmistakably hers. Maybe a prank, but from who? She sliced the tape and peeled back the flaps. Inside was a handheld camcorder, old and slightly scuffed, with a worn leather strap that had cracked from use. Beneath it was a crumpled sheet of paper with nothing written on it, and a faint smell of mildew rose from the box. Lisa wrinkled her nose, lifting the camcorder out. It was heavy, an older model she hadn't seen in years. The lens was scratched, the buttons dulled from years of wear. When she turned it over, she saw that there was a tape already loaded, its little window dark and opaque. Lisa felt her pulse quicken as she stood in the kitchen, staring at the device. She almost laughed at herself for the rising panic. It was just a package, a harmless delivery. But it wasn't harmless, not really, because she hadn't ordered it. And the idea that someone had written her name on it, knowing where she lived, sending it in the middle of the night, it all felt wrong. Her hand hovered over the power button, but she hesitated. She didn't want to watch whatever was on the tape. It felt like crossing some invisible line, like inviting trouble into the house. But curiosity won out. She carried the camcorder into the living room and sat on the couch. The screen flickered as she pressed play, static crackling across the tiny display. Then the image resolved into a dimly lit frame, shaky and out of focus. It showed a house, the angle slightly tilted, as if the person holding the camera was walking. Lisa leaned closer, her breath catching in her throat as she recognized the entryway. It was her house. The camera panned slowly, capturing the details of her home, the coat rack by the door, the framed photo of her and Mark on the wall, the potted plant in the corner. The perspective moved forward, stepping through the house with an unnerving deliberation. It moved past the living room, the camera lingering on the couch she was sitting on, then down the hall toward the kitchen. The glow from the pendant light above the counter was faint but unmistakable. The camcorder was filming the kitchen moments before the tape had arrived. Lisa's fingers tightened on the device, her breath coming faster as the footage continued. The person filming was walking upstairs now, the frame jerking slightly with each step. The camera panned over the hallway, the guest bedroom, the bathroom, before finally stopping at the master bedroom door. The screen filled with the image of her bedroom door, slightly ajar. For a moment the camera paused, the lens focused on the faint sliver of light spilling through the crack. Lisa's hands trembled as she watched, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. She felt an overwhelming urge to stop the tape, to shut the camcorder off and throw it as far away from her as possible. But she couldn't. Her body was frozen, her eyes glued to the tiny screen. The door opened slowly on the footage, revealing the dimly lit bedroom beyond. The camera moved forward, the faint sound of breathing audible over the low hum of the camcorder's internal mechanisms. Lisa could see herself and Mark in the bed, their forms still beneath the covers. The person filming moved closer, the camera angling down toward her sleeping face. The frame shook slightly as the person crouched beside her, the lens capturing the faint rise and fall of her chest. Lisa felt bile rise in her throat as she watched the footage, a deep, primal fear spreading through her body. The camera lingered there for a moment, and then the screen went black. Lisa dropped the camcorder onto the couch, her hands shaking so violently she almost couldn't stand. The silence in the house was suffocating now, every creak of the floorboards and distant groan of the wind amplified in her mind. She looked toward the staircase, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching her. But the house was empty, or so it seemed. Her first instinct was to wake Mark, but something held her back. She didn't want to scare him, not yet. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe it was a sick joke, a prank that had gone too far. But the footage felt too real, too immediate, to be anything but genuine. Lisa forced herself to her feet, clutching the back of the couch for support. She stared at the camcorder, its screen dark and lifeless now, and felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Someone had been in her house, walking through her rooms, standing over her while she slept. They had filmed her, and then they had left, leaving the tape behind like a twisted calling card. But why? And more importantly, were they still here? Lisa stood frozen in place, every instinct screaming at her to move, to do something, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the dark screen of the camcorder. The footage had left her disoriented, her thoughts racing in every direction at once. Her mind grasped at possibilities. Maybe it was an elaborate prank, a sick joke meant to scare her, but the weight of it, the intimacy of the intrusion, made that feel impossible. Someone had been in her home, someone who knew her name, her address, and her habits. And the tape was proof they had walked her halls while she and Mark lay vulnerable in bed. She needed to wake Mark. She told herself that over and over as her bare feet padded across the cold hardwood floor toward the staircase, but a whisper of doubt kept tugging at her. What if whoever had filmed the footage was still inside? The thought sent a chill racing down her spine. She paused at the base of the stairs, straining to hear anything, any movement, any sound that might confirm her worst fear. But the house was silent, oppressive in its stillness. She took a deep breath and forced herself to move, one step at a time, gripping the banister so tightly her knuckles turned white. Mark was still asleep when she reached the bedroom, his face slack and peaceful in the dim light. She hesitated before shaking him awake, her fingers trembling as they gripped his shoulder. "Mark," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He stirred but didn't wake, and she shook him harder this time. "Mark, wake up." He groaned, his eyelids fluttering open, and he squinted at her in confusion. "What's going on? What time is it?" His voice was groggy, tinged with irritation. "There's something you need to see," Lisa stammered. She wasn't sure how to explain it, how to condense the sheer horror of what she had just witnessed into something coherent. "Someone was in the house. I found a package. It has a tape. They were filming us, Mark." His expression shifted immediately, the haze of sleep replaced by concern. He sat up, rubbing his face. "What are you talking about? Filming us? Who?" "I don't know," Lisa said, her voice breaking. "But it's on the tape. You have to see it. They were walking through the house while we were asleep. They filmed us in bed." Mark swung his legs over the side of the bed, his movements deliberate now, his body tense. "Show me," he said, his tone firm. Lisa led him downstairs, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a little safer with him awake, his presence grounding her in a way that made the suffocating fear slightly more bearable. But the dread lingered, a heavy weight pressing down on her as she handed him the camcorder and explained how she had found it. He frowned as he examined the device, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he finally pressed play, the room was filled with the soft whir of the tape, the static flickering across the screen before the footage began. Mark's expression hardened as he watched, his jaw tightening with each passing second. Lisa could see the shift in him, the way his shoulders stiffened, his breathing growing shallow. He didn't speak until the screen went black, the tape ending in the same chilling silence that had paralyzed her moments earlier. "This isn't a joke," he said, his voice low and grim. "This is serious. We need to call the police." Lisa nodded, relief flooding through her at his suggestion. She had been too overwhelmed to think clearly, but Mark's calm determination gave her a glimmer of hope. Maybe the police would be able to make sense of this, to track down whoever had done it. Maybe they could put an end to the nightmare before it got any worse. Mark grabbed his phone and dialed, pacing the living room as he spoke to the dispatcher. His words were clipped and precise, his tone leaving no room for doubt about the urgency of the situation. Lisa sat on the couch, hugging her knees to her chest, her eyes darting around the room, as if she expected someone to appear from the shadows at any moment. When Mark hung up, he turned to her. "They're sending someone over. They said not to touch anything until they get here." Lisa nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The minutes stretched into an eternity as they waited, the silence in the house amplifying every creak and groan. Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that whoever had left the package was still out there, lurking just beyond the edges of the light. When the knock finally came at the door, Lisa jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. Mark crossed the room quickly, peering through the peephole before opening it to reveal two uniformed officers, their faces stern and professional. One was a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, the other a younger woman with sharp eyes that scanned the room as soon as she stepped inside. Mark explained everything, showing them the package and the camcorder, replaying the tape for their benefit. The officers watched in silence, their expressions unreadable, but Lisa could see the tension in their posture. When the footage ended, the younger officer, whose name tag read Sergeant Hayes, turned to Lisa. "You said you found this on your porch. No return address, no sign of who delivered it." Lisa nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't hear anything until the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, the package was just sitting there. No one was around." Hayes exchanged a glance with her partner before turning back to Mark and Lisa. "We'll need to take this as evidence. Our tech team can analyze the tape, see if they can pull anything useful. In the meantime, I suggest you check your locks, maybe even consider staying somewhere else for a few nights. Whoever did this might still be watching." The words sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through Lisa. "You think they'll come back?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It's hard to say," Hayes replied, her tone carefully neutral. "But this kind of behavior usually escalates. It's better to be cautious." Lisa felt Mark's hand on her shoulder, steadying her as she tried to process what Hayes was saying. The officer stayed for another hour, inspecting the house and asking questions, but there were no obvious signs of forced entry, no footprints or fingerprints that they could find. By the time they left, Lisa felt more vulnerable than ever, the weight of their warnings pressing down on her like a physical presence. Mark double-checked all the locks before they went upstairs, but sleep was impossible. Every sound, every shadow seemed sinister, and Lisa found herself staring at the ceiling, her body rigid with tension. Mark tried to reassure her, but she could hear the unease in his voice, the fear he was trying to hide. Sometime around 3 a.m., just as she was starting to drift off, the faint sound of movement downstairs jolted her awake. It was subtle, barely audible, but unmistakable, the creak of floorboards, the faint shuffle of footsteps. She sat up, her breath catching in her throat as she strained to listen. "Mark," she whispered, shaking him urgently. "There's someone downstairs." Mark woke instantly, his body snapping to attention in the way only true fear can induce. He didn't even question her, he must have heard it too. The sound came again, faint but deliberate, like someone trying to move quietly but failing to account for the old, creaky floorboards. Mark put a finger to his lips, signaling for her to stay quiet, and slipped out of bed. He grabbed the baseball bat he kept wedged between the wall and the nightstand, a precaution he had laughed about when he first bought it, never imagining a night like this. Lisa wanted to stop him, to beg him not to go, but the words caught in her throat. She watched as he crept toward the bedroom door, his grip tight on the bat, his movements slow and careful. Her heart felt like it was going to explode as he leaned his ear against the door, listening. The sound came again, louder this time, a soft rustling, like fabric brushing against wood. It was in the living room now, unmistakable. Lisa clutched the edge of the blanket, her fingers digging into the fabric as Mark slowly opened the door. The hallway beyond was dark, the faint glow of the nightlight near the stairs doing little to dispel the shadows. Mark moved silently, his bare feet making almost no noise against the carpeted floor. Lisa stayed frozen in bed, too terrified to follow but unable to look away. The seconds dragged on as she listened, straining to hear anything Mark's footsteps, the intruder, anything that would give her a clue about what was happening. And then, a sudden crash. The sound of something heavy hitting the floor, followed by a sharp, guttural yell from Mark. Lisa's blood turned to ice. She bolted out of bed, adrenaline propelling her forward despite the fear clawing at her insides. "Mark," she called, her voice cracking. There was no answer. She reached the top of the stairs and looked down, her heart sinking at the sight below. The living room light was on, casting a harsh yellow glow over the scene. The coffee table was overturned, one of its legs splintered where it had hit the floor. The camcorder lay in the center of the room, the tape ejected and unspooled, its glossy black ribbon trailing across the carpet like spilled ink. Mark was nowhere to be seen. "Mark," she shouted this time, her voice echoing through the house. She descended the stairs, her knees weak, every instinct screaming at her to turn back, to lock herself in the bedroom and call for help. But she couldn't leave him. As she stepped into the living room, she felt a strange sensation wash over her, like she was being watched. The air was heavy, oppressive, and the silence was deafening. She turned in a slow circle, her eyes scanning every shadow, every corner, but there was nothing. The room was empty, the front door still locked, the windows unbroken. It was as if Mark had simply vanished. Her breathing grew rapid as she approached the camcorder. It felt wrong to touch it, like she was tampering with something cursed, but she needed answers. She picked it up, the plastic cool and smooth against her trembling fingers, and pressed the playback button. The screen flickered to life, showing the footage from earlier, the shaky images of her house, the hallway, her bedroom door. But then, the footage continued, moments she hadn't seen before. The camera moved back downstairs, the frame bouncing slightly, as if the person holding it was running. It lingered in the living room, pointing directly at the front door. Mark appeared in the frame. Lisa's breath caught as she saw him, still gripping the baseball bat, his head turning left and right, as if searching for the intruder. The camera zoomed in, focusing on his face, his eyes wide with fear. And then the screen went black again. "No," Lisa whispered, her voice shaking. "No, no, no." The camcorder beeped, the battery light flashing red, and the screen went dark. Lisa stared at it, her mind racing. The footage made no sense. Who had filmed it? How had it captured Mark without her hearing the camera or seeing anyone else in the house? And where was he now? A sound behind her made her spin around, her heart slamming against her ribs. The coat rack near the front door swayed slightly, as if someone had brushed past it, but the air was still and no one was there. Lisa backed toward the kitchen, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. She reached for the knife block on the counter, her fingers curling around the handle of the largest one. She felt ridiculous holding it, like some terrified heroine in a bad horror movie, but she didn't care. The weight of it in her hand was comforting, however slight. "Mark," she called again, her voice trembling. "If you're here, answer me." The silence stretched on, unbearable in its weight. And then, a faint sound, almost imperceptible, a whisper, coming from the hallway behind her. Lisa turned slowly, the knife shaking in her hand. The hallway was dark, the shadows thick and impenetrable. But she could hear it now, clearer than before. A voice, low and distorted, murmuring words she couldn't quite make out. She took a step forward, the knife held out in front of her. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it was all she could hear. It was coming from the guest bedroom. The door was ajar, just enough for a sliver of light to spill through. Lisa's pulse pounded in her ears as she approached, her every instinct screaming at her to turn back. But she couldn't. She had to know. She pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The room was empty. The bed was undisturbed, the curtains drawn, the air still. But the whispering continued, coming from the closet. Lisa felt like she was moving through a nightmare, her body acting against her will. She reached for the closet door, her hand trembling so badly she could barely grip the handle. She yanked it open, the knife raised, ready to defend herself. But there was nothing there. The whispering stopped. Lisa stood frozen, her chest heaving, her mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. And then she felt a hand on her shoulder, cold and heavy, its grip tightening. Lisa screamed, the sound raw and guttural, her instincts taking over as she spun around and slashed with the knife. The blade cut through empty air. There was no one behind her. The hand she had felt so solid, so real was gone, and the space was as empty as the closet had been moments before. She staggered backward, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. Her grip on the knife tightened, the cold sweat on her palm making it slick. Her mind raced, grasping at explanations. She had felt it. The weight, the pressure. It couldn't have been her imagination. But there was no one here. She glanced back into the closet, its dark recesses mocking her with their emptiness. The air felt wrong, heavy with a sense of malice that pressed against her skin like static. "Mark," she yelled, her voice breaking. The sound echoed through the house, unanswered. Something was deeply, terribly wrong. The whispering hadn't been in her head. The hand on her shoulder hadn't been a trick of the mind. And Mark was still missing. She stumbled out of the guest room, her heart pounding as she made her way back into the living room. She reached for her phone on the coffee table only to find it wasn't there. No, she had left it right there. She was sure of it. She dropped to her knees, frantically searching under the table, behind the couch, even sweeping her hand through the mess of the unspooled tape on the floor. It was gone. Her lifeline, her only connection to the outside world, had vanished. Lisa's stomach turned as realization crept in. Whoever had been in the house, whoever had filmed her and Mark, they hadn't left. They were still here. A sudden noise made her whirl around, knife raised. It was faint, but distinct, the soft creak of a door opening upstairs. Her blood turned to ice. She stared at the staircase, her mind screaming at her to run, to get out of the house, but her legs refused to move. The sound came again, louder this time, and it was followed by slow, deliberate footsteps. Tears blurred her vision as she forced herself to her feet. She backed toward the front door, her shaking hand fumbling with the locks. She needed to get out, to find help, to call the police again. Her fingers found the deadbolt, twisted it open. But before she could reach the handle, the footsteps stopped. Silence. Complete, suffocating silence. Then, a voice. Low and guttural, it came from the top of the stairs. "Lisa." Her name, spoken with deliberate slowness, each syllable drawn out in a way that made her skin crawl. She froze, her back pressed against the door, unable to look away from the staircase. The light from the hallway illuminated the first few steps, but the top was shrouded in darkness. She couldn't see who or what was up there. "Lisa," the voice said again, and this time it was closer. Her hand found the door handle, yanking it open. The night air rushed in, cold and sharp against her flushed skin. She bolted out onto the porch, the knife still clutched in her hand. She didn't stop running until she reached the street, her bare feet slapping against the pavement. She glanced back at the house, its dark silhouette looming against the starless sky. The windows were empty. There was no movement, no sign of anyone following her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She kept running. She didn't know where she was going, just that she needed to get away. The knife felt heavy in her hand, a useless weight against the overwhelming fear that consumed her. Her thoughts spiraled. Mark was still in the house. She had left him. What if he was hurt, or worse? She reached the end of the block, gasping for breath, and looked back again. The house stood silent and still, but as she stared, she saw something that made her heart stop. In the upstairs window, the faint outline of a figure. It didn't move, didn't wave or gesture, just stood there, watching her. Lisa turned and ran again, her vision swimming with tears. She needed help. She needed someone to believe her, to go back into the house and find Mark. She didn't stop running until she reached the gas station at the corner, its fluorescent lights humming softly in the otherwise silent night. The clerk behind the counter looked up as she stumbled in, her face pale and streaked with tears. "Please," she gasped, clutching the edge of the counter for support. "You have to call the police. Someone's in my house. My husband. He's still in there." The clerk's expression shifted to concern, and he reached for the phone. But as he started to dial, the lights in the station flickered. Lisa's breath caught as she turned toward the glass doors, her blood running cold. Outside, across the parking lot, stood the figure from the window. It was closer now, its form still indistinct, shrouded in shadow, but she could feel its gaze, sharp and unrelenting, boring into her. The lights flickered again, plunging the station into brief darkness. When they came back on, the figure was gone. Lisa stumbled back from the glass doors, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. The knife was still in her hand, but it felt useless against whatever this was, something that moved faster than she could comprehend, something that left no trace but dread in its wake. The gas station clerk was staring at her, the phone pressed to his ear, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Hey," he said, lowering the phone slightly. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost or something." Lisa could barely form the words. "It was there," she whispered, pointing toward the parking lot. "It was standing right there." The clerk followed her gaze, peering out through the glass. The lot was empty, the faint hum of the streetlights the only sound. He frowned. "There's no one out there," he said, his tone skeptical. "Are you sure?" Before he could finish, the lights flickered again, this time staying out longer. The station was plunged into near darkness, the only illumination coming from the faint glow of the emergency exit sign. The clerk cursed under his breath, fumbling with the phone. "Stupid power. This happens sometimes. Don't worry, it'll come back." A loud, metallic bang interrupted him, the sound reverberating through the small store. It came from the back, near the storage area. Lisa froze, her body tensing as the noise echoed in her ears. The clerk looked toward the rear of the store, his expression shifting from annoyance to unease. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, setting the phone down. Lisa wanted to scream at him to stop, to call the police again, to do anything other than walk toward the source of the noise. But her voice wouldn't come. She stood rooted to the spot, her fingers tightening around the knife as the clerk disappeared into the shadowy aisles. She heard his footsteps retreating, then stopping. Silence followed, heavy and oppressive. "Hey, is someone back here?" the clerk called out, his voice echoing faintly. Lisa strained to listen, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. A new sound reached her, then quiet, almost imperceptible at first, but growing steadily louder. A low, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming against metal. The noise sent a shiver down her spine. "Ma," the clerk called from the back, his voice wavering now. "You might want to come look at this." Lisa didn't want to move. She didn't want to see whatever had made that sound. But leaving the clerk alone felt worse somehow, so she forced her legs to carry her forward. The knife shook in her hand as she approached the end of the aisle, peeking around the corner. The clerk stood near the storage room door, his back to her. He was staring at something, his shoulders hunched, his posture unnaturally rigid. "What is it?" Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. "Hey," she tried again, stepping closer. "What's going?" The clerk turned then, and Lisa stumbled backward, a scream caught in her throat. His face was wrong, twisted in a grotesque mask of fear and pain. His eyes were wide and unblinking, his mouth stretched open in a silent scream, as though he had been frozen mid-terrified reaction. His hands hung limply at his sides, his entire body unnaturally stiff. Then he crumpled to the ground like a marionette with its strings cut. Lisa stared at him, her mind struggling to process what she had just seen. Her knees threatened to buckle as she inched closer, her trembling hand reaching out to touch his shoulder. His skin was cold, his body completely lifeless. The silence pressed in on her, suffocating. Behind her, the low tapping sound resumed. She turned slowly, every muscle in her body screaming for her to run. Standing in the open doorway of the storage room was the figure. This close, she could finally see it clearly, or at least, she thought she could. Its form seemed to shift and flicker, like smoke caught in a beam of light, its edges blurred and undefined. It had no face, just a smooth, featureless expanse where eyes and a mouth should have been. But somehow, Lisa felt its gaze, cold and piercing, rooting her to the spot. The knife slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Lisa backed away, her legs trembling so badly she thought they might give out beneath her. The figure didn't make a sound as it moved, its presence oppressive and suffocating. "Stay away," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Stay away from me." It stopped, tilting its head as though considering her words. For a moment the room was silent again, the tension so thick Lisa could barely breathe. Then, it raised one hand, long, thin fingers extending toward her, and pointed. Lisa's stomach churned as she followed the direction it was pointing. It was pointing at the camcorder. the camcorder that was somehow in her hand. She didn't remember picking it up, didn't know how it had gotten there. But there it was, the small screen glowing faintly, its lens aimed directly at the figure. Without thinking, she raised it higher, her thumb fumbling for the record button. The figure didn't move, didn't react, as the tape began to roll. As the lens focused on it, the figure seemed to distort further, its form flickering and unraveling like a poorly tuned television signal. But the camcorder didn't falter. The image remained steady, capturing every unnatural twist and flicker of its form. The figure took another step forward. Then another. The screen went black. Lisa screamed. The scream tore from her throat, raw and desperate, but the figure didn't falter. It moved closer, slow and deliberate, as though savoring her terror. The camcorder's screen remained black, but she could still feel its weight in her hand, a strange and useless burden now. The gas station's flickering lights pulsed erratically, casting disjointed shadows that danced around the room. Lisa stumbled backward, her heel catching on the edge of a fallen display rack. She hit the floor hard, the impact jarring the breath from her lungs. The camcorder skittered out of her hand, coming to rest a few feet away, its lens tilted to stare blankly at the ceiling. The figure stopped, standing over her, its shapeless form blotting out the light above. Her body screamed for her to move, to fight, to do something. But she was frozen, her limbs heavy with dread. The figure crouched slowly, its movements fluid yet disjointed, like a marionette manipulated by invisible strings. It leaned closer, its faceless head tilting as if studying her. "Please," Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please don't." It raised a hand again, fingers impossibly long, and pointed toward the camcorder lying just out of her reach. The gesture was deliberate, insistent. Lisa hesitated, her mind racing. It wanted her to pick it up, to film again. Why? What would happen if she obeyed? Her gaze darted to the motionless body of the clerk, his expression frozen in terror. Whatever this thing was, it had already claimed one life. The figure tilted its head further, its entire form seeming to shimmer and ripple, like heat waves rising from pavement. The air around it grew colder, the chill seeping into Lisa's skin. Her trembling hand inched toward the camcorder, her heart hammering in her chest. As her fingers brushed against the plastic casing, the figure straightened abruptly, its form becoming unnervingly still. Lisa hesitated, staring up at it. It didn't move, didn't breathe, but the weight of its presence bore down on her like a physical force. She lifted the camcorder, her thumb hovering over the record button. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice breaking. The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, waiting. Lisa swallowed hard, her throat dry, and pressed the button. The camcorder whirred to life, the screen flickering back on. Through the lens, the figure's form seemed sharper now, more defined. Its edges no longer blurred, its presence no longer shifting. The camcorder seemed to anchor it, drawing it into focus. The figure raised its hand again, pointing past her this time. Slowly, Lisa turned her head, her heart sinking as she followed its gesture. The gas station's front doors were wide open. Beyond them, the street was empty, the faint hum of the streetlights the only sound. It wanted her to go. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I'm not going out there." The figure didn't move. It simply pointed, its silent command unwavering. The camcorder grew heavier in her hand, the weight almost unbearable. Lisa's breaths came in short, shallow gasps as she forced herself to her feet. The camcorder clutched tightly in her hands. Her legs felt like lead as she stepped toward the open doors, the cold night air washing over her skin. Outside, the street stretched out in both directions, eerily quiet. The streetlights cast long, flickering shadows, their glow dim and unreliable. Lisa hesitated on the threshold, her gaze darting back toward the figure. It stood where she had left it, its form barely visible now, shrouded in the darkness of the gas station. But she could still feel its gaze, sharp and unrelenting, pushing her forward. She stepped outside. The moment her foot touched the pavement, the gas station lights went out completely. She spun around, the camcorder's dim screen the only source of illumination now. The figure was gone. The clerk's body, too, had vanished, leaving the station eerily empty. Lisa's breathing grew ragged as she turned back to the street, clutching the camcorder like a lifeline. The silence was deafening, the night pressing in on her from all sides. A faint sound reached her ears, then a soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from somewhere behind her. She didn't want to turn around, but she did. Through the camcorder's lens, she saw them. Figures, dozens of them, emerging from the shadows. Their forms were hazy and indistinct, their movements jerky and unnatural. They didn't have faces, just smooth expanses where features should have been. Lisa stumbled back, her hands shaking as the camcorder's screen struggled to keep them in focus. The figures moved closer, surrounding her, their presence suffocating. And then, one by one, they raised their hands and pointed at her. The screen went black. And this time it didn't come back on. Lisa's scream echoed into the endless dark,